Hi, everybody. This is Calvin W. Allison. And for this Memorial Day of 2021, I thought that I would do a video to explain why the Civil War was fought. And so this should be an insightful video. There was a movement going on during the 18th century that as more and more abolitionist people that were speaking out against slavery were becoming more and more influential. This man stood up in a meeting in the South and he spoke against slavery, and then another man got up and he severely beat this man for speaking out against slavery. So John Brown heard about this, and John Brown got some men together and they went to the South and they killed some people in retaliation for what had happened to the man who got beaten. And so John Brown started a movement, and he was going into the South and he was trying to get things started to where he was wanting to free the slaves with a group of people himself, and he was trying to get an army going. But John Brown could never get the support that he wanted. He could never get enough people behind him. And so that was something that hindered his progress. And so John Brown eventually, he got cornered, and he got captured, and a bunch of his men got killed, and he got captured and he ended up getting hung. And that was all this was the official start of the Civil War. This is what caused the South to start getting an army together. This is what started them to prepare, because they felt like, they had this feeling that, things were about to happen, and they were right. And so after John Brown got hung, he got killed, executed, for his attempts to free the slaves in the South. Frederick Douglass said of John Brown, he said that he could live for the slave, but John Brown could die for the slave. And so Abraham Lincoln was becoming more and more influential, and he was having debates, and people were seeing that he was a very powerful speaker, very passionate, very powerful speaker. And so he got nominated to run for president. And he stood on a platform of not allowing the extension of slavery in new territories. And he knew that this would end slavery. Now, a lot of people don't understand Abraham Lincoln's mindset. But Abraham Lincoln wanted to free the slaves right from the beginning. But Abraham Lincoln hoped that he could do it without causing a civil war. Because you got to think about it. In this time in the 18th century, Abraham Lincoln had lots of friends who owned slaves. But Abraham Lincoln was against slavery. But he had friends that owned slaves. I don't know if he had a bunch of them, but he did have some friends that owned slaves. And so Abraham Lincoln was not wanting to go to war with the people he knew, and Abraham Lincoln knew that according to the Constitution, it was very hard to prove that slavery was wrong. At that time, it was. And so when these people, slaves got sold by their own people, and Americans bought slaves and brought them over to America, and they considered them property. And so it was their right to have slaves according to what Abraham Lincoln saw in the law. According to the law, these people bought slaves and they used them for labor to work in their cotton patches and stuff like that, because cotton was the big industry in the South. And so that was the South's main financial means, was cotton. But the North was much more prosperous than the South, but the South was prosperous. So when Abraham Lincoln said that he was not going to allow the extension of slavery into the new territories, the South felt threatened by that. And they felt like, well, then they can't expand in their business of cotton. They can't expand. And so they knew that eventually that the slavery would end and that their means of financial gain would end. And so the South said, if Abraham Lincoln is a nominated president, then they will secede from the Union. So Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as president. He was chosen. He was elected as president. And the South began to secede from the Union. So Abraham Lincoln, he spoke and he said, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, lies the issue of civil war. And he said, you yourselves will be the aggressors. And, he spoke at his inaugural meeting. He said that, it's up to you. That's basically what he said. And so the John Brown movement was the unofficial start of the Civil War. The firing on Fort Sumter was the official start of the Civil War. And so South fired on the North, and that started the Civil War. But Abraham Lincoln was always opposed to slavery, and he was hoping that he would end the Civil War really quickly, and then that the South would come to their senses and accept his no extension of slavery policy. That's what Abraham Lincoln was hoping. But he saw, as the war continued, and the South was fighting much better than what the North expected, and the South was actually winning the war, and they were outnumbered. They didn't have the provisions that the North did, but the South had a great general in General Lee. And so the South was winning the war. And Abraham Lincoln saw that the South is not going to accept his no extension policy. They're just not going to do it. And so that's why he came up with the Emancipation Proclamation. Because the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the southern states only. Now, it was the states that had already seceded from the Union. So you have to think about this. The reason why Abraham Lincoln didn't free the slaves from the states that hadn't seceded from the Union is because the war was going bad at that time for the North, and Abraham Lincoln didn't need any more opposition. He needed all the unity that he could get. And so he didn't free the slaves in the northern states at that time, the states that had not seceded from the Union, because he needed their unity. He needed their support. And if he would have freed the slaves in those states, they might have seceded from the Union too and joined with the South. And so that's why he didn't free all the slaves at that time. And then we know he hired General Grant, and General Grant ended up pressing forward. He just continually pressed forward and eventually won the war. And General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and the war was over. And then Abraham Lincoln put forth the 13th Amendment, which gave the former slaves voting rights, and it gave them a lot of rights. And Abraham Lincoln was able to do what he wanted. The war was over, and he was able to go full throttle into doing everything to make the former slaves equals in the citizenship of America. I mean, you hear people that have no idea when Abraham Lincoln was speaking about things. A lot of times people look at things and Abraham Lincoln was speaking about things and they don't know how to decipher the context of what Abraham Lincoln said. Like you had Abraham Lincoln saying things like, if I could free some of the slaves to preserve the Union, then I would free some of the slaves. If I could free none of the slaves to preserve the Union, then I would free none of the slaves. if I could free all the slaves to preserve the Union, then I'd free all of the slaves. I mean, Abraham Lincoln made statements like that in public because he was still hoping that the South would follow his no extension policy. Abraham Lincoln was trying to do this as courteous and polite as possible to his fellow countrymen. That's why he made statements like that. But you see the heart of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he never owned slaves. His family didn't own slaves. I mean, you see, he used to defend slaves when he was a lawyer. He defended people that were slaves or former slaves. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, he just absolutely detested slavery. Now, when he spoke in public, he said those things to appease both sides. I mean, he was a politician. He had a political mind. And he said things that he said a lot of times to appease both sides. But he never wavered, not one time, on his no extension policy. He never wavered on that at all. His no extension policy would have for certain ended slavery in time. And he never wavered on that. He never one time said, I'm having second thoughts about this no extension policy. Abraham Lincoln never said that. He never wavered, not once, on the no extension policy. Now, when he wrote his private letter to his friend Joshua Speed, and you can view that letter online, that was a private letter. That's where he was revealing his heart to his friend in a private letter that he didn't think anybody else was going to see. But that showed his real heart toward ending slavery. And he spoke to Joshua Speed. And he spoke very clearly. And he said he did not like slavery and he wanted to end it. But for the southern side's sake, the North held their peace about it. And they didn't want to just come in and take their slaves. He said, but he was wanting to do the no extension policy, which would not take his slaves. It would not take his friends' slaves, but it would eventually end slavery. And Abraham Lincoln poured out his heart in that letter to his friend Joshua Speed. And you know that he detested slavery. And a lot of people will try to distort what Abraham Lincoln said in public and try to take things out of context when he said, if I could free all of the slaves, some of the slaves, or none of the slaves to preserve the Union, then I would. But Abraham Lincoln, he always wanted to free the slaves. And you see that in his letter to Joshua Speed. That's where his heart came out. He wasn't talking to both sides of the political spectrum. He was talking, he wasn't talking to two different sides of the political spectrum. He was talking to his close friend, Joshua Speed, who owned slaves. And he was telling his friend that he did not like slavery, plainly and simply. He was telling his friend he did not like slavery, but he also wasn't wanting to go to war with his fellow countrymen. And he presented that very clearly in that letter. But he did say, his no extension policy, he never wavered on that. Never. And when you look at why was he assassinated? Why was Abraham Lincoln assassinated? Because he put forth the 13th Amendment. That's why John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. He said after he heard Abraham Lincoln in a speech talk about passing the 13th Amendment, John Wilkes Booth made the statement that will give the former slaves the right to vote. And he said that's the last speech that Abraham Lincoln will ever make. That until that time, John Wilkes Booth was just wanting to kidnap Abraham Lincoln and try to trade him for more of their soldiers to be released. They got captured in war. John Wilkes Booth had a plan to kidnap the president and then trade him for prisoners of war to get some of their Southern soldiers back because they were so outnumbered. And John Wilkes Booth wanted to keep the war going. But after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, that plan was no good anymore. So then he heard Abraham Lincoln talk about passing the 13th Amendment, and that's when John Wilkes Booth decided to assassinate him. So John Wilkes Booth knew what Abraham Lincoln's heart was toward the former slaves. He knew it. It's interesting that a lot of other people don't know it. You have all these professors and teachers teaching something different, but John Wilkes Booth knew it. And that's why he assassinated Abraham Lincoln, was because he knew that Abraham Lincoln was wanting to give the former slaves equal rights in everything. He was wanting to make it to where the former slaves had the same rights under the Constitution and the laws of America as anybody else. And that's why John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. So it's so clear when you look at it and you wonder, you hear all these different opinions from people talking that have no idea what they're talking about. And there's a lot of people who don't want to believe that Abraham Lincoln was genuinely wanting to free the slaves. A lot of them just say that because Abraham Lincoln was one of the founders of the Republican Party. And they want to make something corrupt about it or something devious about it. And they want to try to make it look like Abraham Lincoln was this devious, corrupt man who didn't have a heart that was actually wanting to liberate these people that were in slavery, which is completely false, because Abraham Lincoln definitely had a good heart and he was wanting to liberate all the slaves, and he did. And Abraham Lincoln, right at the beginning of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln even offered to pay the South for all their slaves. He offered to pay for their freedom. And the South turned him down, said no. Abraham Lincoln offered to buy the freedom of all the South slaves, and the South said no. So, people who say that Abraham Lincoln didn't have a heart that was, that was compassionate, I mean, they don't know what they're talking about. People have, so many preconceptions about Abraham Lincoln, a lot of it because of his quotes, but they don't take the time to analyze the context. They don't take the time to sit and evaluate the surrounding circumstances, the context, and why Abraham Lincoln said what he said in public, and then they don't look at what he said in private and compare them. They don't look at his history. I mean, they don't try to factor in all these things. They just take a few they take a few out of context passages and they try to distort them to present their case. And they don't understand the political spectrum. They don't understand politics. They don't understand political talk. When you're trying to talk to two different political groups, sometimes you have to word things in a way that is appealing to both sides, because you don't want to offend. You don't want to say something, you can either take a stance that's just reckless and say whatever you want and use your words recklessly, or you can say things that are well thought out and that will show both sides that you have compassion for both sides. And Abraham Lincoln was doing that. He was showing the South that he didn't want to go to civil war with them. He didn't want to go to war with his fellow countrymen. But at the same time, he knew that slavery had to end for the progression of America. He knew that slavery had to end. There was so much abolition going on, so many people speaking out. The country was so divided. And Abraham Lincoln wanted to free the slaves. And so naturally, he founded the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln was one of the founders of the Republican Party. And so, look at everything in context, and you look at everything the way it's properly put out, and you will see that the Civil War was fought to end slavery. That's the reason the Civil War was fought. Preserving the Union and ending slavery were the exact same thing. There was no separation in those two. They were the exact same thing. Preserving the Union and ending slavery was the exact same thing. So whenever you heard Abraham Lincoln talk about preserving the Union, that meant ending slavery, because he never once wavered on his no extension policy. Never one time. So anyway, That's something to think about for Memorial Day 2021. And it's something to think about from now on. Anytime you think about the Civil War, anytime someone brings up the Civil War, think about the real reason and don't let the distorted views of others distort your view of the Civil War. The Civil War was fought to end slavery. Abraham Lincoln, as the President of the United States, fought to end slavery, and he was assassinated because of that. He was one of the best presidents in the United States. And in my opinion, he was the best president in America's history.